Hello and welcome to the Enthusiasm Project podcast. My name is Tom, and this is the show that I still don't have a tagline for, so we will get there. Actually, to be in full disclosure for today, I've been doing podcasts every Sunday, and I really look forward to them because they're really fun. But it's been a super busy week and a super busy weekend, and I haven't had anything like percolating in my brain, really, that I wanted to do a show about. And so I was almost not going to do a podcast. And then I got in this whole internal debate over like, well, if you don't want to do it, then don't do it. But it's a commitment you made to yourself, so you should do that, if for no other reason than to do it with yourself. And well, that sounds weird. But anyway, so long story long, I was not going to record a podcast today, and I was just watching some videos, and then I watched a video that sparked a conversation that I had in my brain last night as we were driving home from working on a video project. And then I decided I'm going to jump in and start a start a podcast. So this is very different. I'm still trying to figure out, my podcasting style, and it's easy to be influenced by, lots of other people when you see things that are so well done and just so polished and so perfect. But that was not the intention of me starting a podcast. The whole point, as you know, if you've listened to the other episodes, was to do the opposite of that kind of thing, which is what I do all over YouTube, and I really enjoy it for that platform. But this was more about just exploring thoughts and sort of seeing where they're going. And actually, it's a little hot in this room, and as much as I love the Rodecaster Pro, it doesn't have a pause button, so I'm going to click a fan switch real quick. Here, I'll play the Inception sound for no reason because I can. There you go. There we go. I could have made a joke and made it not seem like I had to step away for a little bit. My only nitpick so far with the Rodecaster Pro is that there is no record pause button, so you can do the whole thing in one take as long as you don't have to pause at all, which is tough because sometimes it's kind of nice just to be able to, pause your recording a little bit. So maybe that's something they'll update in a future video. I really love Rode because they're a cool company. They try to do, I feel that they try to make the products that are the best for their customers. And with the Rodecaster, when it first came out, it only produced a stereo file, and everybody was upset because they wanted separate tracks so they could, it's a multi-track recorder, so you could bring in all the different tracks. And then finally Rode actually listened and released a firmware update that not only enabled each channel to have its own track, but it's something like 14 tracks. Like, they went way overboard, which is, I kind of like. I don't know, I think that's funny, and I like that. But anyway, the video that I was watching just right now was from Peter Gregg. And if you're interested in photography at all and you haven't found Peter Gregg, I highly, highly recommend that you look up his channel. It's Gregg spelled with two G's. So it's Peter, Gregg. And I love his channel because he is the exact opposite of what YouTube is in 2019, and especially what, photography and tech camera YouTube channels are. His production quality is great. His knowledge is, way above average, but his whole style is just sort of, it's just very personable, but it's also kind of a little bit clunky in a really charming way, where he just sort of sets up the camera in his room. His room is set up like Christmas all year long. So no matter what time of year you watch one of his videos, there's Christmas lights and decorations happening. And he just he dives into these thoughts on the camera industry. And the video I've been watching, which I've just sort of been watching in 10-minute chunks over the past few days, is his video talking about the Canon RP, which is the Canon's new mirrorless camera. And he makes such great points because so many people have been tearing this camera apart. But, he's emphasizing that this camera is not for them. That's not who the audience is. But then he goes deeper into Canon's whole marketing strategy of why they would promote this camera, why they won't give specific video features to their, prosumer consumer cameras versus their professional like cinema series. It was real interesting. And I was watching and I was like, wow, he doesn't even cut his videos. Like they're long. This is just a 40-minute long conversation. I was like, he's basically doing a podcast. And I was like, oh, I should do a podcast. I should do a podcast about what I was thinking about in the car last night on the way home. And that's what I'm going to do. So, and I think it's good to get on the record, because what I see a lot, I mean, this is sort of the thing this is going to be a camera heavy podcast, I guess. If you didn't notice that, this is going to be very focused on camera gear. So if you're interested in cameras, I feel like I have some insight to offer. And I am very much a Canon fan. Like Canon doesn't know I exist, and I buy all the stuff full price, so it's not like any kind of sponsored thing. I've just used, since I've got into DSLRs before they even had video capabilities, I just use Canons, and I just really like them. And I've tried exploring other camera brands, especially through school. When we can order equipment, I want to make sure that my personal tastes aren't pigeonholing students and students' abilities. So I try to branch out and get other things from time to time, just so we're capable of working in a variety of different formats. And so we have some Sony cameras. I ordered some Sony cameras last year that came in, and they're great. So we have like an A7S II and a couple A7 IIIs and a A6500. And of course, the Sony RX100 is one of my favorite cameras. It's a little point and shoot. It's just a real great small little camera. I love that camera. But the Sony mirrorless cameras that everybody loves, I don't like. And I was trying to figure out what it is I don't like about them. And the first and foremost, though, the thing that I have been emphasizing in like every comment I leave or every discussion I have about cameras is that in 2019, there are no bad cameras. Every camera is great. So if somebody's asking, which camera do I get from which company and which model, like they're all terrific. They're all great. So you really can't go wrong. It just gets into, more specific features, or if you want to be real nitpicky about cameras and what they have to offer, where, people start to get tribal about it. And so I want to make sure that like whatever camera somebody buys and has and is happy with is a really good camera, especially if it's at all any kind of, in the last couple of years from any manufacturer, they're great. It's just kind of getting into more specific needs and personal workflows. So I just want to emphasize, like, Sony cameras are terrific, even though I don't prefer them right now. That doesn't mean there wouldn't ever be a time in the future. My first video cameras were Sony video cameras, and I loved them. And then I moved over to Canon and kind of back and forth between Sony. But the reason, there's a few reasons that I don't like Sony mirrorless cameras. And first and foremost, the thing that drives me crazy is Canon is the one that started like the quote unquote DSLR revolution, where the 5D Mark II came out and could shoot video, and it just changed everything because suddenly you had this image quality and this shallow depth of field that an amateur or an independent filmmaker could never get up until that point. You'd have to have some kind of budget to make that. And Canon came out and just sort of put video in the 5D Mark II as almost an experimental afterthought, and just to see what happens. And then it literally changed the entire industry, the entire world, and the way things are made, and it just put everything on its head. So that doesn't mean that Canon deserves to be at the top just because they did that 10 years ago or 11 years ago. But what I think happened was when everyone started then buying their cameras, of course, they bought Canon because that was the only option to get a DSLR that you could change the lenses on and shot video. And then slowly other companies started coming around. And I've noticed there's this thing, especially with Sony a few years ago, where it's almost like people were rebelling against Canon, like they hit an adolescent phase. And like Canon was their parent that they just wanted to be rebellious against. And so people were just trading in all their Canon gear and going to Sony kind of just cuz. And, Sony has a lot to offer, but I also think that they kind of get put up on a pedestal more so than they really deserve. And I'm not even talking about other camera companies, other offerings. I'm really just focusing on Canon and Sony because those are the big ones, and those are the ones most relevant to me personally. And the truth is, if you're looking to buy a camera what you're really looking at are that company's lens lineup, because camera bodies come out every year. Typically, if you pursue photo or video for a long time, you will replace your camera body every couple of years or add a new camera body, but your lenses tend to stick around. And I say tend to because Canon is in the process of introducing an entirely new lens mount, so that it could be a shift of, people who've had Canon lenses for a long time things are changing a little bit. But in general, your lenses stay around, your camera body swap out. So over time, you have a lot of money invested into lenses. And if you have one company's lenses and suddenly you want to buy a camera body from another company, that's going to require either a new investment in new lenses, or you're going to have to use some kind of adapter, which pretty much always lowers the abilities of the camera. So it usually negatively affects autofocus and stabilization and just communication with the camera. So usually adapters just aren't really ideal. And the funny thing that I've noticed here is everyone just traded in all their Canon stuff to get Sony cameras, which have all these incredible features, because Sony just packs in like insane features into every camera they release, no matter what the price point is. They just try to load it up with as much as possible, which is really great. But Sony lenses are, not as great. And I can say that after definitely using them. If you go into like their G Master series, the really high-end series, those lenses are magnificent, but they are really expensive and way more expensive than their Canon counterparts. Sometimes, hundreds of dollars more expensive than the Canon version. And then they're great lenses, but other than that, Sony lenses are pretty average and pretty mediocre. Whereas if you flipped over to that version of a Canon lens, it'd be an incredible lens that would last for, years and years, if not decades. And I think that's important for people to realize. So it is kind of an investment in a specific company or an ecosystem when you buy a camera, which is why sometimes people stomp their feet when they say like, I sold all my Canon stuff and now I'm just with Sony specifically. But there's always a trade-off. And the things, what I have come to the realization is, which I think is the best way to sum up the difference between Canon and Sony, and will kind of place, if somebody's trying to figure out where they stand or why they stand there, I think this will kind of help place that, which is Sony values innovation at the price of reliability, whereas Canon values reliability at the cost of innovation. And I know there are other issues into why these multi-billion-dollar corporations make the decisions that they do. But in general, from what you've seen, Sony, like I said, will put an incredible number of features into every new camera release. And it's kind of astonishing. And it's just sort of like whatever the current camera is that's coming out, the most that they can put into that, they will just put everything into it and then ship it out and put everything into the next one and ship it out. So they don't really seem to care that their features can overlap on cameras, or a new lower end camera can, have features that outmatch a slightly older, higher end model. Like they're really just about, all of these features. And that means that for really affordable prices, people end up with, dual SD card slots and 120 frame per second video and beautiful 4K video and all these crazy different formats and really like experimental, interesting stuff. But that comes at a certain cost. And the reliability of Sony's is, I would not be comfortable relying on one. And I do say that from firsthand experience, because their overheating issues aren't as bad as they used to be, but the Sony cameras do still overheat, especially if you're filming in 4K video. It doesn't take very long for them to start overheating, and then you can't use them. And that's not something I would want to do on a really important project, or really any project. And then because Sony packs in all of these features, their battery life sucks on like every camera. And so much so that I was kind of shocked when I opened up the A7S II that we got at school. I noticed Sony just puts 2 batteries in the box with it, because they're like, yeah, this battery life sucks, so here's an extra one no camera companies just give you two batteries on like the default package of the camera. Like usually you have to get, some kind of kit put together, but Sony's just like, this is bad, so here's an extra one. And that is rough, because when you're using these things, it means that if you're using those cameras, you have to invest a lot of money in power and batteries, which is expensive, and that adds on to the cost. But it also means that when you're in the middle of using them, you really need to keep an eye on your battery use, because it drops, almost before your eyes. You can see it, the battery meters go down. And obviously sometimes that can be really unfortunate. And even if you have a whole bag of extra fully charged batteries, sometimes your battery might be low at just a really inopportune time. Or if you have a camera set up on a certain rig, certain stabilizers, whatever, it's not a quick thing to just change the camera battery. You have to go through this whole process, and it slows things down. And, the thing that got me really thinking about this was yesterday, Heather and I shot a promotional video for a nonprofit organization, and we were filming on my 6D Mark II all day long. Well, I shouldn't say all day, for like 6 hours. And we did interviews and B-roll footage and all kinds of stuff. And I had the battery grip on the 6D that had 2 batteries in it, and the battery meter dropped down 1 bar. So I think there's Canon battery meters show 3 bars of health. So at the end of all of that, there were still 2 bars of health left after the entire day. And some of the interviews, the shortest interview we shot was 10 minutes. There was another one that was like 15 minutes, maybe another 10-minute one. One of them was 30 minutes. It maxed out the camera till the 29-minute limit hit, and it stopped recording. And gigabytes upon gigabytes of B-roll footage. And that blew my mind. And of course, I brought extra batteries, so it wouldn't have been a problem if those had run out, but there was no need to change the batteries. And that is huge right there, because when you're out of batteries, you need to wait for something to charge. That is just, death to a project. And so that got me thinking of like, wow, I love that I can just trust Canon cameras. And I know that they don't have the most innovative features sometimes, or, it takes a long time for Canon to implement a feature that other companies have had for what seems like years sometimes. And that can be frustrating. But what you can guarantee when Canon does implement a feature is that it's going to work and it's going to be reliable. When the EOS R came out, people were really upset because it didn't have in-body image stabilization, which I agree is something that would be terrific. And if I'm going to buy another camera in the future, I want to make sure it has that. But Canon was interviewed about it, and they said that they were trying to do it and it's on their roadmap, but they just couldn't get it done right. And my bet is they could get it done, but it just wasn't done reliably. And so it was going to be something that was going to decrease the reliability of the camera, and they just left it off. And whenever it does show up in a camera model, my guess is it will work extremely well. Kind of like autofocus, where DSLRs for the longest time, you just did not use or even have autofocus for video. And some companies tried to implement it and it was pretty bad. And then Canon hit with dual pixel autofocus, which is basically magic. And no company can compete with Canon's autofocus right now at all. And it took them a little while to get there, and then they got there, and it just works. And I love that, because, I use Canon cameras at work. I think we have like 30 different DSLRs and a C100 in the media program where I teach, and the cameras just work, and they're being used by high school students every day, and they're checked out and taken home and gone on, traveling with high school students. And even the Rebels, the cheapest DSLRs that Canon makes, last years and years and just keep working. Despite that blows my mind. No other cameras can hold it. The Sonys have to be treated like I don't know, museum artifacts, where it's, there's I can't just give one to someone and they use it, and it's a nightmare. I know that wasn't very eloquent, but that is how I feel. Whereas the Canons, they just work. And over the past 7 years that I've been teaching digital media, they've always just worked. I've had 2 cheap Canon lenses break, the 18 to 55 kit lenses, And full disclosure, I was the one that broke them and had to replace them. But in each case, I just dropped them not very far, a couple of feet to the ground, and then the lens broke because those lenses are they're the super cheap lenses. They don't work that well. And that's kind of a bummer. But once you get beyond that super, super intro level for lenses, everything just kind of lasts, and the camera bodies last, and they're reliable, and the battery life is really good. And, but they don't always have the most innovative features. Or the most current features, I should say. And it kind of depends then on what you value, which one is best for you. What I appreciate about Sony very much is that what Sony does and what they have done by shaking up that whole industry for the last, 4 or 5 years, or however long they've really, since I think it was the A7S, the first one that came out, and people were amazed at the low light capability. Since then, that's when people started migrating over to Sony. And what I appreciate is because of what they pack into every single camera, it really does highlight what is missing on the other companies' cameras, and it pushes them forward a little bit more, or urges them to focus on certain areas that their customers really, really need. And that's awesome, because that wins for everybody. Because if you buy a Sony camera, you get all these great features, but then it means if you're sticking with one of the other companies, it's more likely that they're going to start focusing on those features as well. So it's that whole competition, a rising tide lifts all ships kind of thing, and competition is good for everybody in a situation like that. But I get tired of people, getting upset with Canon. And my favorite camera of all time that I've used for the last year and a half or so is the 6D Mark II, which came out in the summer of 2017 and was basically rated as like the worst camera of the year, and this sucks, and it's terrible, and there's no 4K. And then from July to December, people actually started using the camera instead of just looking at the specs or doing like a quick in-store demo or whatever, or listening to like the initial super biased YouTube reviews. And once they started using the camera, they were like, this camera is actually really good, and like exceptionally good. And all of the criticisms kind of melted away, and it's just a really strong camera. The same thing happened with the EOS R. When that came out, people were excited that Canon was doing a 4K mirrorless camera, but then, the limits popped up. The 4K is really cropped, and it's sort of like this has weird, is it sort of just a 6D, but it has the 5D sensor? And it was just kind of a confusing camera, and people were getting upset with it. And then eventually people started using it. And the people who actually use it feel that it's really good, and they're really impressed with it and how good it is. And I'm sure that the EOS RP is going to be the same thing. It might not be for everybody, but the people who go for $1,300, you can buy a full frame mirrorless camera. This is amazing. No other company offers anything like that. They're going to be really happy with that camera, and it's going to be, I think it's going to find its way into a lot of people's hands that are currently talking about how bad it is. And I'm interested to see that. And the same thing's going to happen whenever Canon releases their next camera, which I think is rumored to be a higher end EOS R camera. And whatever the price is, so higher end, maybe that means $2,500, maybe that means $5,500. No one really knows, until it's released. But whatever it is, people are going to complain about it, and then people are going to use it, and they're going to be like, oh, it's actually really good. That's what happens every single time. And it's very frustrating. Whereas with Sony, people just sort of dive in and go like, oh my God, Sony's amazing. And then they use it, and they kind of like, well, actually, this part is kind of bad. Like the A6400 that just came out, which is Sony's like smaller. It's really heavily geared towards like YouTube and vlogging. And it looks like a great camera. And people are freaking out because Sony finally has a flip screen, a front-facing LCD screen, so you can see yourself while you're recording, which is a very big deal. Except it's the stupidest design I've like ever seen on a product. Sony cameras, one thing that immediately puts me off from buying one for myself at all is the fact that they don't have a full tilt swivel LCD screen, which is not actually just for vlogging and when people want to see themselves. It's useful in 1,000 different ways. Just yesterday, filming interviews, I'm behind the camera the whole time, but the camera's at all these different angles, and I need to sit in one spot and stare at it for, 20 minutes or whatever, 30 minutes while an interview's happening. I need to be able to tilt the screen and move it and get it out of the sunlight and show, where I can see it the best. when you're in, you're at a weird angle, the camera's low, the camera's up high, you can move and see your image perfectly and it's not blocked or obscured by anything. It's magical. And then I laugh when I see these Sony cameras that people have to attach these monitors to, and they go like, "Oh, this is so cool. Now I have like a monitor." So you just you spent, however much money on your camera, and now you spend another hundreds of dollars on this monitor, and now you have this goofy rig that's like huge. It makes no sense. And I don't know why Sony stuck with their terrible LCD screen design. It's just awful objectively, no matter how you slice it. But the A6400 finally has a screen that flips up, but it does so in this really stupid, convoluted way where it kind of like has to be pulled out and then flip up, and then it blocks the regular viewfinder. And then if you put a microphone on it, it blocks the LCD screen. And it makes no sense. And it really only works if you're, in front of the camera. So if you're off to the side of the camera, if you're behind the camera filming something at an unusual angle, the screen doesn't really offer any new functionality. And it's like, why wouldn't you just put the screen that flips out to the side and rotates? I think Panasonic has that too, as well as Canon. But Canon puts it on pretty much everything. And it's great. It's like you once you have it, you can't live without it if you do camera stuff. And for me right there, like I won't buy a Sony camera because they don't have that. So that takes it off the table for me. But also the battery life, as I mentioned, being terrible, again, takes Sony cameras off the plate for me. Sony colors are a thing that I don't like. That is one thing I really love about Canon. If you're interested in color grading, or you're willing to color grade, and then you shoot on a Sony camera in S-Log, you have a lot of options. It gives you this really high quality, really flat picture profile that you can adjust and customize and color grade and have it look outstanding. But that takes a lot of time. And depending on who you are and what your project is, not everybody has the time to color grade or wants to. And that's a very personal, whatever your workflow is, whatever your project needs are. Whereas with Canon, if you really want to color grade, you can, like this 6D Mark II doesn't have C-Log, but you can put in a flat picture profile pretty easily and then color grade it and it looks good. But Canon looks good straight out of the cameras. Is if you're just looking for natural, faithful colors. If you're looking for something really stylized, that's different. But Sony colors I found are always really cold and kind of washed out. And, everything's a little bit gray and blue, but it's not a white balance issue. It's just how their colors work. Whereas Canon, everything looks natural and beautiful. And sometimes I find myself color grading clips from Canon cameras almost just for the sake of feeling like I need to color grade something for it to be good, or at least adjust it a little bit. Whereas really I'm kind of like, this looks fine the way that it is. Like I probably don't need to do this at all. And that's huge. And especially, depending on your workflow, if you have stuff that needs to be done really, really quick, or if you do, of course, a lot of YouTube stuff that you don't want to color grade and you just want something that looks terrific out of the camera, Sony sucks and Canon is way better. I know that's like, maybe that's not the most politically correct way to say that, but Canon is really good and Sony has had enough time to get it right, and they're getting better, but they're not there yet. The same goes with autofocus. I kind of laugh when people say how great Sony autofocus is, because it has gotten a lot better, but it's still really bad, especially compared to what Canon offers. As soon as you hit autofocus to track something on a Canon camera, you're set. You don't have to even think about it. Whereas on Sony, weird stuff just happens, or it just totally fails, or it's super slow, or it's constantly breathing in and out, and you have these weird autofocus pulses. It's not good. it's not good. You can spot it immediately if you know what to look for. And the most important thing is it's not reliable, especially because on most of the cameras, you don't have a screen that's facing you to look at. So at least with Canon, you can easily see if you have those nice screens. If something's gone wrong with your autofocus, you can usually see it right away. But Sony, you kind of just have to hope for the best. And then you can end up missing something that's really important, or having to reshoot something that you don't want to or don't have time for, or having to do the thing where you rig up a whole separate monitor display so that you can see in front of the camera if you're in front of the camera filming. And that's just annoying. So, I mean, those things right there, for me, the flip up screen, the battery life, the color science, the autofocus, and just the overall reliability, those 5 features right there win Canon every time for me personally. just personal. Doesn't mean Sony's not great. And again, the caveat being that any camera you buy in 2019 is a terrific camera. So now we're into like splitting hairs between it. But, I'll take a Sony camera over any camera from, 10 years ago or whatever. So they're not bad cameras. It's just for me personally, I know that a lot of people feel like Canon has fallen behind and it doesn't seem like it's the sleekest, coolest company anymore. And I think that if you're really serious about just getting work done, it's worth at least looking at what Canon has to offer, just in terms of reliability, if nothing else. Because if you do your own stuff, obviously you want it to be reliable. But if you're working for a client and you have to deal with reliability issues on your camera, that is, I can't even imagine the embarrassment. If your batteries are dead and you have to wait for them to charge, or your camera is overheating, or your focus messed up, I just wouldn't even want to have to deal with that. And yesterday when we were filming our project, I just remember sitting there staring at the camera while it was working and just going like, God, I appreciate this tool so much for what it lets us do and how reliable it lets us do it. And that those were the thoughts that were going through my head on the way home. Heather passed out and fell asleep, and I was just sitting there staring at the road going like, I really do like Canon cameras. And that doesn't even go into the lenses. I love Canon lenses, but that's almost a whole separate thing there that we kind of talked about at the beginning of I guess it's a discussion. I don't know if it's a discussion, if it's just me talking, but just to kind of give a quick overview, Canon lenses, if you look at them, especially once you get an L series lens, if you're serious about your cameras and you jump into an L series lens, that lens is going to be around forever. And with the mirrorless cameras, Canon did introduce the RF mount, which is different than the EF mount that they've had since like the 1980s. And that's kind of scary because if you really want to go into the R series, there are new lenses to buy for it, which is kind of a jump. And for a lot of people who have been sticking with Canon and waiting to go mirrorless, that might actually be their out to go to another company. But at the same time, Canon did come out with these really great adapters for the EF lenses to the R series. And I know I said adapters are terrible, but when the original manufacturer, and in this case Canon, made them to mount EF lenses on the RF mount, there is no difference. It makes them native lenses. The autofocus works just as reliably. The overall communication with the camera is exactly the same. And then they did take it a step further, and they added like some really cool stuff to their filters, including one of them has like a built-in variable ND. Like you can drop in filters in some of them, or you can add, like one of them has an ND filter built into it, which is really cool because then you're not putting filters on and off your lenses. You can just put it on the adapter and it's going to work on every lens, no matter what the size or the mount or whatever. And that's actually really smart. And I think that that's an awesome example of adapters usually suck, but Canon made them work well, and then also not only made them reliable, but added in some extra functionality. So you're not just using an adapter. Now it's a usable tool where you'd almost prefer to use it. You've got that adapter on your camera. You've got filters. You don't have to have a whole separate pouch with filters for different thread sizes and whatever. That's really cool. And just the overall reliability. That was kind of another thing I had left off, which, to be fair to Sony, I haven't, other than with my RX100, I haven't taken Sony's in crazy weather conditions. I live in the desert, so in the summertime it gets really, really hot here. There's usually a few days throughout the year that get over 125 degrees, close to 130. There's usually, at least 1 or 2 days per year where the area we live is the hottest place on the planet. So that's, fun. But that really does take a toll on cameras. And I have had Canon cameras come close to, they start getting really hot, but they keep working. Whereas I've had my RX100 start to overheat like almost immediately. And the same goes in the cold. I haven't taken like the bigger Sony cameras, like the A7 III or anything, into like extreme cold temperatures. but I have had my RX 100 in some pretty cold temperatures, and it just won't even turn on. Like, I don't know if the batteries drain or what, but it dies and becomes unreliable. Whereas the 6D Mark II, it's like nothing is affected by the cold. I've even used I used the original 6D in the coldest temperature I was ever in, which was negative 22 degrees in New York City several years ago. It was unbelievably cold, and the camera gave me no issues the whole time. I thought it was gonna freeze. I thought it was gonna break. I didn't like shatter in my hands. I don't know, and it worked fine the entire time. And I have some of my favorite pictures from that trip taken in those temperature conditions. And I don't want to say definitively, since I haven't used the A7 series cameras in those weather conditions, but I feel that they would not be as reliable in those extreme conditions as the Canon cameras are. And that doesn't even count in stuff like rain and snow and dust and, impacts and shocks and things that can be kind of bad for cameras. So my ultimate point in this, as I was watching Peter Gregg's video and he was talking about Canon, and I was watching him just sort of go through his thoughts on their releases, and he was, offering positive feedback and some critical feedback. But what really stuck out in my head was my feelings on that. I'm not going to stand up for a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Like, they don't need my help. But I feel like Canon cameras are often undervalued because they're not as sexy as the new things coming out from the other companies. And I think a lot of other companies look at Canon and listen to Canon users and implement features that Canon users feel Canon is not giving them. And then that gives those other companies an edge. And then people, get mad at Canon or they leave or whatever. But there's something to me that's so appealing about just that practical, usable reliability that you can count on day in and day out, no matter what you just don't have to think about it. Your camera is going to work. All you need to do is figure out what you need to do with it. The tool gets out of the way. And that's my favorite, that's what I talked about last week when I was talking about the Rodecaster to do these podcasts with. That is my favorite thing. That's why, I love Final Cut Pro, because it just gets out of the way and lets me create my videos. I love Canon cameras because it gets out of the way and let me do photo and video. I love the Rodecaster because it gets out of the way. My favorite tools are tools that get out of the way, not tools that I have to deal with all the time. And that, and I don't think that Canon gets enough credit for that. But Peter Gregg's discussion was interesting because he was talking about how Canon is missing the mark because Canon was underestimating YouTube as an influential place for camera purchases, meaning that Canon would come out with a camera like the RP, which they know is marketed to someone who has, maybe a Rebel, maybe they don't even have a camera yet, but that's going to be their first full frame camera. It's going to be either a first quote unquote serious camera or an upgrade from a lower model camera. And that's who it's for. It's not necessarily going to be someone who pays attention to every spec. It might not necessarily be someone who does video and photo professionally, but that's who that camera is for. And Canon knows that. And so that's, they're not worried about what some big YouTuber says about, this camera doesn't compete with my Sony A7 III or my Canon C300 or whatever, some super expensive camera. But what Peter Gregg was mentioning was that Canon underestimates that even though people on YouTube represent a small user base in total, and making videos for YouTube is a very small percentage of how these cameras are used, it is the place people go when they're looking for information. So it's essentially a very vocal minority where if I'm looking up a new camera, I'm going to go to YouTube, especially if I'm just jumping into the world of cameras and stuff. I'm going to go to YouTube, I'm going to type in the camera model, and I'm going to listen to what a bunch of YouTubers who are probably tech and photo channels, I'm going to listen to what they say about that camera. And that is going to influence me. If they say it's terrible, I'm going to think it's bad. If they say it's great, I'm going to think it's good. If they say the one that they use, I might think that that's the one that I need to use. And that's not because you have no opinion of yourself, of your own. That is just because if you're jumping into something new that you don't have a lot of background information on, you're going to trust the opinions of people who are, or at least seem to be, professionals. And so Peter Gregg's thought was that by overlooking the YouTube community, or at least not including them in the purpose of this camera or whatever, that they end up hurting themselves because people look it up, they see it getting bashed, and then they don't want to buy it. And I think that is very interesting. A lot of us have heard about, like, you know, the social media, YouTube, Facebook, whatever, echo chamber that can develop when you're just sort of surrounded by things that back up your own opinions, or you know, you watch. I watched a video this morning that was about a dog that lost a lot of weight. It was like a 70-pound dachshund that then lost weight and became healthy. And then my YouTube recommendation was just all people's personal fitness transformations, because it thought, you watch something lose weight, now watch all these other people lose weight, which is just wrong. But my point is, if somebody goes on and looks up the EOS RP and clicks on one video where somebody's like, oh, this camera sucks and Canon dropped the ball, all they're going to see is a bunch more videos that say essentially the same thing. And then it's going to dissuade them from buying it when it might actually be perfect for them. Or they might end up spending $700 to get $700 more to get a camera with features that they don't really need. But it's because everybody loves the A7S III from Sony, and they're going to think that that's the camera I need. But there's no need for half of those features. And, you know, that's just kind of a frustrating situation. My door is opening in a very scary way right now. Hello.
Are you on your podcast?
I am. And would you like to join me or say hello?
Oh,
Since I can't record pause, I just kind of finished up a discussion about cameras. So here's the wonderful Heather Ramirez, aka Heather Just Create.
Where's your air horns?
I don't have the air horn one yet. I think
How
I
do
have.
you not have that one default programmed?
What do I have? I have the jokes.
The joke.
But
Hi, everybody.
What
Heather here.
well, I was actually getting close to wrapping up my podcast.
Yeah.
We talked about cameras, my thoughts on cameras, why I like Canon over Sony. It was a discussion I had in my brain when you were asleep in the car last night. Mm-hmm. But more importantly, whatever camera somebody has or uses, they can use it to make stuff.
Yes.
You're in the middle of a thing about making stuff.
I am.
Maybe you could tell me and us about it.
Yeah, sure. So tomorrow I'm kicking off a new challenge called hashtag 10-day tackle.
And tomorrow would be the
February 25th. Okay. Yeah. So I'm kicking off this challenge to kind of just help people. You know, I feel like people think about starting something, creating something, a YouTube channel, an Instagram thing for their hobby that they do on the side, or starting a blog or a website or something. But it so often what I see is it's on the to-do list, but people either feel like they need to take a bunch of time to plan, or they're uncertain that their idea is good enough, or, you know, there's a lot of just hesitation where all of a sudden that idea has been on the to-do list for months, and then if not years. I know you know what I'm talking about.
Oh, yes.
So what I wanted to do is just kind of be the excuse, the reason to get people to just try, because you really don't know. The best way to know whether your idea is good enough, or whether, you know, you need to learn more about YouTube or whatever, is to just try. And I feel like 10 days, doing this every day for 10 days, basically people are going to like identify a challenge to overcome, and then document the journey of overcoming that challenge. So whatever the goal is, for example, if people wanted to cut out sugar from their diet for 10 days, or go to the gym every single day for 10 days, or Tom came up with this idea where he's been into minimalism recently and said, you know, I'm going to get rid of 10 things every day for 10 days. And after that, you're going to have 100 things.
100 fewer things.
Yeah. But, you know, basically documenting that journey through YouTube videos, because I think YouTube videos are probably the most, I don't know.
It's the most accessible way to do it.
Most accessible, and also the most, like, complicated. I feel like once you get YouTube, you can do like an Instagram photo or a blog. And so, you know, people are going to be documenting their journey overcoming that. And I feel like that gets people to not focus on, do I have the perfect editing software, or do I have like does my video look okay? What my video is not perfect enough. Well, it's not about the video, it's about your journey. And that's what I want people to focus on is the story and the journey. And in doing 10 pieces of content documenting your story, you learn so much. I can't even tell you how much you get out of it. Especially if you're just having fun and you're not worried about subscribers, or it's just a matter of like I'm focusing on me right now, and I'm just gonna share that. So yeah,
it's a lot of fun. So you can go to 10daytackle.com, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or
10daytackle.com.
go on YouTube after tomorrow and look up the hashtag 10daytackle, which this sounds paid, but there's no cost involved.
It's free. I just wanted to do it and see what happened, see if anyone signed up, which people are signing up, which is really cool. So you can go on YouTube to see what people post and just search the hashtag 10daytackle.
Yeah, and it works because one of the weeks on this podcast I talked about being more ideas versus things and being more interested in what people do with the tools rather than just the tools themselves. So we spent a whole podcast talking about camera versus camera. Now, what would you do with that camera? What story would you tell? How would you use that tool? And I think that's a cool opportunity. I mean, this podcast is an example of like, you just do it. Just start the thing, because you'll never start it. You'll never be better if you don't start.
Exactly. And I told everybody, my first messaging to the people who signed up so far was like, just so you know, every single video you're going to create is going to suck.
I know.
Like, just know out of the
I didn't want to believe that. I thought my first video was so good and I would never look back and think it's like cringy or anything.
But now that they know that, I feel like, okay, so yeah, it's going to suck. Who cares? Like, all right.
You're going to learn something from it.
Yeah.
And the next one's going to be a little better. And you're going to learn something from it. The next thing's going to be a little better.
The 11th video is going to be better. And the 12th and the 13th and et cetera and et cetera. So yeah.
Cool. That's a great way to wrap up this podcast. So thank you for coming in and help me tie it all together. I appreciate that. So that's pretty much wraps it up for this episode of the Enthusiasm Project podcast. You can reach me.
I'm here to see how you edit with this road thing.
You can reach me at So Darn Tom on all the things, or of course look up the Enthusiasm Project on YouTube. Until next week, I've been Tom and you've been great.